Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Today is February 9th, 2026. I welcome you all. This is a live historical reading from Beyond the River, and today I am continuing with chapter 16, The Trap. I am Pavio G, your host, and I welcome you all. I do these readings for a specific reason to help people relearn how to read, how to enjoy books, and how to process history word by word. Even though you may not see the physical book, hearing each word pronounced and taking time to think through what's being said is a form of deep learning. As a history scholar focused on slavery and abolition, I believe reading is one of our most powerful tools for understanding truth, resistance, and survival. This session is for education, reflection, and historical literacy. So let's go ahead and begin in less than 30 seconds. Thank you all for being here. Okay, we are in chapter 16, The Trap. The summer of 1838 was hotter than usual in the towns on the Ripley line, especially inland from the river. On weekends, families flocked to the shores of the river where temperatures were a few degrees cooler. Children crowded the sandbars, splashing and screaming as they escaped from the wretched air into the lukewarm water. Ladies conversed over the fluttering of their fans in parlors darkened by shades and drapes pulled tightly closed to shut out the sun. Porch sitters swatted mosquitoes and horses flicked flies with their tails. Days were longer than nights, though little was accomplished, since the pace of life was so slow that even the box turtles moving through the gardens and across the road seemed to move faster than most people. The horsemen who came over from Kentucky seemed all the more conspicuous that summer as they frantically ran their horses with coats matted down in sweat and hooves, sending up clouds of dust through the quiet, sluggish town into the hills. I apologize, where they gathered um, possessors of like-minded men and hunted humans as if they were deer. From June 10th through Friday evening, June 15th, heavy storms pummeled the valley every day. The river rose and temperatures temporarily fell. Flash floods out of the creeks killed one man on the road between Ripley and Cincinnati. On the 11th, a few hours before midnight, citizens, flipping pages here, you all. These citizens is where we're at here. The citizens of Ripley and other Ohio Valley towns felt the quivering effects of an earthquake whose epicenter was somewhere around St. Louis. The aftershocks as far to the east as Ripley were only identified as such after the local papers reported the phenomenon. By the weekend, all worries had turned once again to the soaring temperature, which rose as high as 95 on some days with humidity even higher. And I appreciate each and every one of you all listening currently right now. I thank you all for being here. Despite the climatic challenges that summer, slaves continued to cross the river, often arriving by their own willpower at Rankin's door, wet with sweat, throats parched after climbing the steep hill. And the slave hunting riders seemed to increase as the summer progressed. Our neighborhood has been unusually infested with Negro hunters who have, in several instances and in various ways, displayed the demoralizing influences of slavery, said a citizen of Sardinia at a meeting called to discuss the problem. In one instance in June, the citizen went on to say a Kentuckian and a hired Gunn from Ohio rode to a house in Sardinia on the afternoon of the Sabbath and inquired about a stray horse. The Kentuckian pretended to be an abolitionist. By the man in the house knew that the abolitionists were not in the habit of hunting horses on the Sabbath. And when I come back in less than 30 seconds, we'll pick up with he surmised. Please stand by. Okay, I am back, you all. I appreciate you all waiting. So we are picking up. He surmised they were slave hunters and thus asked them to leave his property. The mercenary agreed to leave, but the Kentuckian declined the offer. The homeowner grabbed his axe, and repeated the order. The Kentuckian drew a pistol. The man advanced with his axe, and the Kentuckian retreated. But as he left, he suddenly turned around and shot his pistol twice, missing the man both times. Then he walked away. On June 20th, several days after the storms had passed and temperatures had returned to the 90s, one of the beastlies down on Front Street brought a tall, heavy-set black man up to Rankin's house. A runaway slave between 35 and 40 years old and weighing about 185 pounds, the man had been hiding in the Beasley's barn since the early morning hours. Lowry, who was at home for the summer, took the man to the cellar beneath the barn, then went into town to get a sense of whether or not the slave's master was in close pursuit. Lowry learned quickly that the slave belonged to a man by the name of William Greathouse, who lived in Mason County, Kentucky, that he had run away the day before. The Greathouse valued him at $1,500. That Greathouse was indeed in town with a number of men, that he was absolutely certain that his slave was hidden somewhere in the town of Ripley, and that he and his men intended to watch all the roads that day and night in search of their runaway. Lowry, who knew of flipping pages, you all, Greathouse, and had heard that he was a hard customer to deal with, was certain now that the man in his father's barn was the same man Greathouse was boasting he would kill for. The other Rankin brothers with experience on the underground were in Sardinia for 3 days at a music festival. Lowry's parent and the other children went out of town for the day, to return in the early evening. To continue harboring a sought-after fugitive much after dusk was unwise, but to take him alone when such a vigilant posse followed was unnerving to Lowry. And so he recruited the help of James Gilliland's son, Alexander, who had chosen not to attend the festival. Together, they made a plan to leave as soon as the sun had set, and to reach the deepest woods as soon as possible. Now, it was cloudy, windy night, and between the house and the woods was a vast cornfield through which the three men must walk their houses. But as soon as they were 50 feet into the field, Lowry stopped. He was sure he heard voices. As the wind rustled the corn, it carried with it the indistinct sound of suppressed conversation. He changed their course to move with the wind so that their own sounds would not be carried back to the people hidden somewhere in the field. Near the center of the field was an old black walnut tree. When they reached it, Lowry dismounted and asked the other two men to wait for him while he inspected the field to find the sources of the voices. On the edge, near one of the roads out of town, he was able to spot 5 men watching the road. They were near enough to Rankin's house that Lowry felt he should warn his family, who he was certain had returned home. Okay, I do apologize, you all. So I'm going to pick up where so he went back to the house to which his family had indeed just returned. There he and his father agreed that the younger brothers would carry a lantern back and forth between the house and the barn for at least the next hour to distract the men in the field and hold their attention while Lowry, Alexander, and the slave, whose name was John, led their horses through the rest of the field, past the rail fence, and into a densely wooded area. The scheme worked, and the three men, safely through one ring of fire, rushed their horses down a deep ravine and up again on the other side, as fast as the uneven nature of the ground would permit our horses to travel, Lowry later recalled. Through another of Rankin's cornfields, along the edge of a long, densely timbered tract of several miles that skirted Red Oak Creek, then halfway up a hillside, they rode single file, with Gilliland in front, John in the middle, and Lowry at the rear. After several hours of riding, a heavy rain began and continued most of the rest of their journey. About an hour before dawn, they arrived at their destination, the tavern of John B. Mahan in Sardinia. But then, Mahan, once described by James G. Birney as muscular, raw-boned, and stalwart, had been working with Levi Coffin in Indiana and with Rankin in Ohio for nearly a decade. Often the fugitives moved from Rankin's to Alexander McCoy's house in Eagle Creek and on to Mahan's, though the routes differed depending on the weather and the location of the men in pursuit of the slave. Lowry and Alexander warned Mahan that Great House was in the county and was determined to round up his slave. Lowry suggested sending John on to the Highland County and points north that very day. But Mahan thought it was better to keep him until it was clear that the slave master and his posse had left the county. And so Lowry joined his brothers at the music festival in the same town, and John the slave remained with Mahan. In the days ahead, John told Mahan that for the most of his life he had been the property of a man named Allen, also in Mason County. But one day, Allen's daughter claimed she was attacked by a black man. John was the chief suspect. Allen felt he must sell John, despite John's claims that he had nothing to do with the assault. Around that time, Greathouse had made it known that he wanted another slave. And so Allen sold John to Greathouse with the stipulation that if it was ever proven that John was guilty of assaulting Allen's daughter, then Greathouse promised he would sell the slave to the Southern traders and send him downriver. Because John feared such a fate, from the moment he began working for the Greathouse, he also began plotting his escape. He fled Kentucky on the night of June 19th. During his days in Sardinia, John divided his time among Mahan's tavern and garden, and Mahan's store, which was across the street from the tavern, and he attended an abolition meeting at the Presbyterian church. Some in the town felt that Mahan should keep John behind closed doors. But after a few days, without the appearance of any slave catchers, Mahan felt it was safe to allow him to be outside and to relax in preparation for the next leg of his journey north. For Mahan, taking in the slave, feeding him, providing a change of clothes for him, and supplying him with spiritual nourishment was an act of God. For Greathouse, it was closer to an act of war. On June 24th, word came out of the countryside that Greathouse was still in the country and was riding towards Sardinia. Mahan and his network responded quickly just after sunset. Lois and Abraham Pettyjohn rode, turning pages, rode into Sardinia and took John to Lewis's firm. Several miles north of town, the next night, just after sundown, Jackson Myers, a man who often rode for the Underground, took John to the farm of Mahan's brother, William in Highland County. From there, on the 26th, Myers and John took William Mahan's horses and traveled north. By most accounts, Myers took John all the way to Canada. Though a gentleman of property and standing in Mason County with nearly 800 acres valued at 22,800 and 13 slaves worth a total of 3,300, Greathouse also had a criminal record. An 1831 indictment for fraud described him as a wicked and depraved person seeking to obtain his living by various subtle, fraudulent, and dishonest practices. Now he was fuming like a steamboat fighting the river current. His slave had disappeared somewhere on this land beyond the river, and no one would tell him where the man was. Greathouse knew his slave had been in Ripley. He knew he had been in Sardinia, but where was he now? On the 25th of June, Mahan's wife watched out an upper-story window at Greathouse, and a small band of ruffians appeared at the Mahans' front door. She listened while her husband calmly told Greathouse that he could search the premises if he wished, but that no black man resided within those walls. Then she saw something that made her heart beat so loudly she feared Greathouse might hear it. Hanging from the window directly above Greathouse's head was a shirt, described later as a dickie, that the slave had worn when he first arrived in Sardinia. Mahan, too, remembered the shirt, its arms nearly touching his head, and he watched the slave master's eyes closely to see where they were focused. Filled with impatience and disgust, Greathouse's eyes stared fiercely into Mahan's, hoping to scare the preacher into telling the truth. Greathouse could have identified the shirt his slave had worn the night he disappeared from the Kentucky farm, but the slave owner's obsessive focus on Mahan kept him from closely observing anything else. Now, once one of the Huggins brothers wrote later, after searching through the country for some time, Greathouse concluded that his slave was at the house of Louis Pettyjohn. He and his mercenaries traversed the country for 5 or 6 miles around Sardinia, and having succeeded in collecting a mob of 20 or 30 persons of the filth and offscoring of society within that bounds, marched to the house of Mr. Pettyjohn. At 11 p.m. on June 25th, Louis Pettyjohn responded to heavy rapping at his door and found Greathouse standing a few steps in front of a rabble of at least 20 men smelling of whiskey. "I want my black man," Greathouse said. "I have no black man," Pettyjohn said. He then demanded the men's names, which they refused to give. Greathouse fired back a demand to enter the house to search. Pettyjohn refused permission. Greathouse said he had a warrant, and as Pettyjohn leaned his candle toward a piece of paper to read it, a man rushed in, grabbed the candle, and pressed a pistol to Pettyjohn's chest. "Damn your abolition soul," Greathouse said, as he motioned the other men into the house. "As if you open up your mouth, you will be dead." They searched the house and found no black man. Greathouse then told Pettyjohn that if he did not reveal whose house the man was hiding in, he would receive 500 lashes with a cowhide. Another man struck Pettyjohn twice with a club, while still another struck the nightclothes off his wife. Greathouse gave him a choice: $50 if he told them where the man was, or death to himself and his family if he did not. Pettyjohn told them the escaping slave was at the Campbell house, several miles away, so the horsemen left without, of course, giving Pettyjohn $50, leaving the warning that if they had been misled, they will return and fulfill their threat. No one was home at the Campbells, as Pettyjohn well knew. No Campbells and no fugitive slave. Upon their return to the Pettyjohns, the mob, now nearly 30 horsemen strong, found an empty house. And incensed, Greathouse swore he would soon return with 200 men from Kentucky. Greathouse left Ohio later that night in a torrent of dust, heat, and anger, swearing and vowing to all he met on the way to the ferry that he would return one day to seek amends somehow for the loss of his slave, property that he claimed had a value of $800. The horsemen in his posse, most of whom were from Brown County, rode home. One from Sardinia, who may have been drinking later that night, stood in the street outside of Mahan's tavern and cursed at him, screaming that there was a $2,500 reward for his head. A week later, in the early hours of July 1st, a 2-story, 30 by 26-foot house burst into flames in Red Oak. It was the home of an interracial school that had been proposed at a meeting late in 1836 at the home of a local farmer and anti-slavery advocate named John Shepherd. The school had opened in May 1838. Tuition was $4 a session. Shepherd, Gordon Hopkins, and Isaac Sutherland, all members of the Ripley Anti-Slavery Society, were its administrators. Boarding had been arranged in the neighborhoods of Red Oak and Ripley. Now the dream of several years was flipping pages, was in ashes. And we, ladies and gentlemen, we have about 2 more pages prior to us finishing. Now, no one knew who had done it, but many people suspected it was the work of the Great House's cronies in Brown County. On July 22nd, shortly after the wheat harvest, another Great House runaway, a man named Nelson, escaped through Brown County. He came with a black man named Benjamin Vaney, who lived in Georgetown, had received Nelson through one of the Rankin sons, and now was guiding him to the next safe house. No slave catchers were in pursuit. Great House was not aware yet that Nelson was gone. They did not stop at Mahan's, but went on past Sardinia to the Huggins farm for some time and actually worked on the land to earn some money before proceeding north. No one on the line thought much about Great House and his slaves for the rest of the month, though everyone seemed to feel an indescribable tension building along the river. In early August, farther east, the Parkersburg Gazette in Virginia expressed the sentiments of many people who live south of the river. They said the following: in the last 3 months, slaves valued at from $15,000 to $20,000 have run away from a small section of this county and state. And although immediate pursuit has been made and large rewards offered in every instance, not one has been apprehended, and there is a reason to believe that most of them are now beyond the limits of the U.S. To chronicle these facts in superfluous labor so far as this community is concerned, but we wish it to be known as widely as possible that an organized band is residing in Ohio who are constantly guilty of inducing, abetting, and aiding these escapees. Whether they are in the pay of the abolition societies may be conjectured, but there is no doubt that facilities are furnished the runaways, which require the expenditure of larger sums of money than it is in the power of slaves to procure. Women and children of all ages have gone among the rest, and yet their pursuers, although frequently on their trail, have been uniformly baffled in their endeavors to reclaim them. The runaways are forwarded by night in covered wagons, or are furnished with guides and led through the most unfrequented roads and by paths, and are encamped in the woods or concealed in the towns. Their pursuers are misled by false information. Obstacles are thrown in their way, and signals are made in their presence, and when answered, they are deceptively told that they are welcome to search. Such are the facts. Then, on August 3rd, what seemed a routine act on the underground, just as the Parkersburg newspaper described, occurred in Sardinia. What was really happening was far from routine. A large, puffy-looking white man who called himself Mr. Rock came to Sardinia late that night, accompanied by a black woman, and determined to talk to Mahan. It was late, but Mahan, in his night shirt, with a rifle at his side, answered the loud knocking at his door. Standing outside, still holding his rifle, he listened carefully to the man's story. Unknown to Mahan, the man was really James Rock Perigo, who lived at the time in Mason County, Kentucky, on the property of William Greathouse. Rock told Mahan that he lived near the river on the Ohio side and that the Negro woman had come to his house in search of her husband, a slave named John, who had belonged to Greathouse. Did Mahan know anything about such a man who might have come through Brown County in June? Mahan told Rock that he knew of 2 runaways by the name of John who had passed through the area that summer, and one did say he was a Greathouse slave. Where was the slave? Asked Rock. Mahan told him that John was probably in Canada by now. Could Mahan take care of the slave woman from this point forward? Mahan said he could guide her to her husband, but asked if Rock could take her. If he did, Mahan would pay him $3. Rock agreed to do that, and then asked Mahan to write a letter that would facilitate such a journey for both Rock and the woman. Mahan agreed to do so, and that very night, by the light of the full moon, wrote a note for Rock to take with him to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. And they wrote, "Dear sir, you will take care of the oppressed for the Lord's sake. Send her to Mr. Johnson's, brother of the Reverend Hezekiah Johnson, 10 miles north of Hillsborough, or to Thomas Hibbins at Wilmington. The Lord bless you. 2 o'clock in the morning, by moonshine in the streets. Yours, John B. Mahan." After receiving the $3 in the letter, Rock and the woman left Mahan, who assumed they were on their way to Highland County. Turning the pages. In truth, they returned to their horses and met up with William Greathouse, who was waiting for them at a concealed location. On August 14, a grand jury convened in Mason County, Kentucky, to consider the possibility of indicting John Bennington Mahan for stealing William Greathouse's slaves. The hope among Greathouse and his slaveholder friends was to identify all the links in the chain that extended from Kentucky to Canada. Mahan was one link that could eventually lead to the others. In this mission, the slaveholders believed anything was justified. What have we to do with slavery? Northerners often asked. In September 1838, some of them would find out. Ladies and gentlemen, we are done with our reading for today. And when I meet you all again, if I don't read it prior to doing another live, we will go into chapter 17. The matter is highly mysterious. And the first line in that one goes, on Monday, September 17, 1838, Greathouse returned to Ripley with a band of horsemen who gathered on the bank of the river like an ominous force moving swiftly toward destruction. I see you all on the next reading, and I thank you all for being here. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Make sure that most importantly, you share the video with others who may need the information. Have a beautiful and blessed day, and we shall talk again.